Hi, and thank you for listening to episode 0 of Pandemic Dialogues. My name is Luke Perez, and I am joined by my co-host, Trevor Shelley. We are both faculty members in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. In response to the global pandemic of COVID-19, our school has decided to take on a new initiative wherein we look at works of literature, political philosophy, and economics on the origins of social and political order and disorder. In this episode, we begin a close reading of Albert Camus' novel, The Plague. Written during World War II, Camus' novel response to the political totalitarianism that he saw in the 1930s and 40s and views human disease as a kind of analogy for thinking about political disease and political disorder. Additionally, Trevor and I discuss how COVID-19 has provoked many different types of responses, from panic, social retreat, and social engagement. We invite you, our listeners, to grab any edition or translation of this novel and join us as we investigate what Albert Camus is trying to teach us through his novel, The Plague, and how it might help us understand pandemic diseases as an opportunity to begin social renewal. Trevor, it was about 3 weeks ago when you suggested to me that you were about to assign, or at least offer to your class, the option of dropping the last couple of reading assignments for your semester and reading Albert Camus' novel, The Plague. That was before our university went to spring break. That was before the coronavirus epidemic in the United States began to skyrocket. Since that time, obviously our world has transformed dramatically. Every major university in the country is now effectively doing all their courses online with very, very few exceptions. 2 articles over the last weekend were published and specifically mentioned Albert Camus' novel and its relevance to understanding the historical sort of context of where we find ourselves. And what I thought we might do to preface or to begin our podcast series is talk briefly about our motivations for reading The Plague. And so I want to sort of start then and just ask you why you even began to talk about this text, why you were thinking about assigning it to your students, and what you hope to get out of maybe doing it as a podcast.
Well, I encountered Camus and this work, The Plague, years ago in grad school, and it did have quite an impression on me. There's something about the work that speaks directly to situations of crises like a plague brings about, but it's also representative of the broader human condition, the situation we always find ourselves in. For Camus, the human being is always in a situation of plague of some kind, internally and externally. The human condition is itself full of challenges that we must respond to. And in his project, it seems to me, is one of finding the responsible way to respond. What are the resources and the tools that allow us to become responsible and ethical, moral beings in what is, in fact, a situation of constant or potential crisis? And so Camus, as a result, I think he's very much a critic of progress, or the hubris that comes along with progress and maybe advances in modern science and technology. We have indeed come very far, but we should not forget that we are still vulnerable beings, susceptible to death, accident, misfortune in many ways. And so Camus uses the metaphor in this narrative of the plague to remind us that in this situation of vulnerability, we must find ways of properly and ethically and responsibly orienting ourselves.
That's really good, Matt. In fact, something you mentioned in your comments just now, that Camus was a critic of progress. One of the reasons that attracted me to this book, to this project, is there's this tendency, I think, to view coronavirus, its global spread, as somehow unprecedented. And yet it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to look backward into previous histories. There's been a handful of, maybe even more than a handful of references to the Spanish flu of 1918, the sort of last real big global plague of a sort. And many of us today in our sort of technological postmodern society have reached a point where I think the subconscious belief that we've solved that, we're beyond the point of pandemic, that technology has rid us of that as a major concern for our lives. And I think for a lot of people, that's maybe perhaps the scariest part about it. There are diseases in the world. We still have cancer. We still have the flu. We still sort of get chickenpox when we're children, but they're not going to kill us. And they're not going to kill us in a way that seems random and indiscriminate in the way that coronavirus seems to be doing, and the ways in which other plagues in the past have done that. That's, I think, one of the real reasons why I've wanted to turn back to this text myself, because I double majored in classics as an undergrad. And so I immediately sort of thought of Thucydides' reference to the plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War. I even actually thought of other pieces of cultural reference of plague in sort of the Western canon or in really sort of like human society. And so I think there's a lot to be gained by looking back to literature and looking back to what previous generations of history and philosophy has given us moderns, us sort of contemporaries, in order to contextualize and understand the coronavirus, right? We can look at the charts and the graphs that are being, on the front page of every newspaper every day and look at these exponential rates, and we can become paralyzed because it seems like there's nothing we can do about it. And yet, there seems to be a non-scientific way that actually is offering us something that is at least as helpful, if not more helpful, in understanding it. I don't think we should take coronavirus unseriously. We need to take it very seriously, but we also don't need to be paralyzed by it, and we don't need to sort of retreat into fear. We can recognize that human society of all type have dealt with these kinds of events before, and so we can use this text as a kind of springboard for thinking about it, for talking about it, and for understanding the situation as we see it now.
Yeah, I think that's right. Great texts, whether it's Camus' The Plague or, as you referenced, Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, various books of the Bible, and otherwise, grant us some imaginative distance from what we're bombarded with daily in the news, and these potentially overwhelming fears, as you rightly suggest, this anxiety that many of us are filled with. By returning to these texts, we garner some distance, and our attention is drawn to the fact that this is neither entirely novel, and that maybe our surprise itself ought to be moderated. We should perhaps be less surprised that we are encountering events and questions and problems that our ancestors and forefathers have similarly grappled with, which is to say that notwithstanding the advances in science and technology, the human condition, the situation in which we find ourselves is not that distinct. And if I could, having recently read Machiavelli with my students, Machiavelli's Prince, I couldn't help but think of him and his work in light of the present moment. Of course, Machiavelli is famous for many things, or infamous perhaps for many things, but considering the role of fortune in the lives of human beings is something that he's very interested in. And he famously asks the question of just how much fortune can do in human affairs, and wonders in what modes it may be opposed. In the 25th chapter of The Prince, he raises the following. He says, "I judge that it might be true that fortune is arbiter of half of our actions, but also that she leaves the other half, or close to it, for us to govern." And he then compares or likens fortune to a river, and suggests that we might, in fact, build dams and dikes to prevent and mitigate and limit the role of fortune. And of course, this is fortune in the positive and in the negative sense, good fortune and ill fortune. We might in fact build up ways to mitigate fortune's role, and perhaps increase or decrease this 50 percentile role of fortune in our lives. And that seems to be really an insight into the possibilities, or maybe an encouragement of the possibilities of the modern scientific project within which we are living today. Camus is something of, I think, a skeptic to the extent which we may master fortune. And this is something that is raised by Alain de Botton in his article that you referred to earlier, Luke, where, if I could just quote once more briefly, Botton writes that Camus was drawn to this theme of the plague because he believed that actual historical incidents we call plagues are merely concentrations of a universal precondition, dramatic instances of a perpetual rule. that all human beings are vulnerable to being randomly exterminated at any time by a virus, an accident, or the actions of our fellow man. So this situation of our vulnerability is one for Camus that reminds us of the imperative of ethics and reminds us that we must find some proper way to orient ourselves in the world so as to be human, that are responsible human beings. This for him is the challenge that the plague, I think, sets before us. And it is the challenge of this very moment today as we wonder, what ought we to do? How ought we behave? And what is the best way to think about this COVID-19 crisis?
When you, a couple of weeks ago, had mentioned the Machiavelli line, I thought of a similar reference or a similar insight to this problem from Reinhold Niebuhr in one of his early works, Irony of American History. He writes that every technological advance that we humans sort of seem to sort of view as the kind of, I think his word is harbinger or guarantor, that mankind will be redeemed because of this new technology, is often the cause, or at least the occasion, for a new dimension of ancient perplexity. Niebuhr, I think, understood that although technology can be very helpful, we can look at modern medicine, we can look at air travel, we can look at the internet, and the very tools that you and I are using to make this podcast in order to help other people understand a pandemic and see it in a broader historical context. These things are quite wonderful. And yet we shouldn't fool ourselves. We shouldn't be led into a false pretension that all of our ills or all of our problems can therefore be solved because of technology, right? Sometimes there is not a technological solution to the problem that you have. The real solution has to come from internally to yourself, to your disposition. Mark Levecki, who's got the other piece that we'll talk about in a second, says that what makes Camus' novel here so meaningful is that we can understand through this novel how humanity acquits itself in times of crisis. And that ultimately, I think, is what we need to understand, right? We can't turn to technology. Even as we use technology to find a potential vaccine, to find a treatment, to find all these other things, that in and of itself does not mean that we've solved the problem, right? And the only way to really solve it is, again, to look inwardly towards ourselves, to our community, to our political lives.
Yeah, that's right. And really, I guess one might want to suggest that there are, in fact, no solutions in the strong sense of the word for the human condition seen as a problem. We can find technical remedies and means of mitigating instances of ill fortune manifest in the form of pandemics and otherwise. But the question of, as you rightly raise, how humanity acquits itself in crisis is an inescapable, intractable, insolvable problem. And over the course of the novel, Camus demonstrates or produces for us different characters who respond in different ways. And we are drawn in imaginatively to this situation, which on the one hand might seem so close to home because we are in this COVID-19 crisis. But on the other hand, we participate in the actions and activities of these characters to maneuver morally, let's say, and test and judge accordingly to the responses and the actions of these characters to understand and come to terms with which are maybe more responsible modes of living. So Luke, in turn, I'm interested in asking you, as a student of American grand strategy and foreign policy, what is it about this book in particular that you think might be of interest?
That's right. I'm a scholar of American grand strategy and national security. My normal scholarly interests are not in 20th century French literature, but what did interest me in the novel when you were describing it to me is obviously this fictionalization of a historical circumstance. I have been slowly led over the years to view literature as an untapped resource for understanding strategy. And my interest in this has come about because Yale has a well-known program in grand strategy, and two of its founders, John Gaddis and Charles Hill, have both written books that argue the best way to understand grand strategy is to understand it through the Western canon, right? That it's literature, philosophy, and history that's the fundamental framework for thinking about strategy, because you have to understand human character, and you have to understand that because strategy is fundamentally about a kind of means-ends relationship, you cannot fully make decisions or understand how other people have made decisions regarding the means if you don't first yet know what the ends are. Having said that, let me quote from the opening passage of the novel. At the very end of the preface of part 1, Camus says, "But perhaps the time has come to drop preliminaries and cautionary remarks and launch into the narrative proper." And so what I would like to do, if that's okay with you, Trevor, is launch into the narrative proper. If you can tell me a little bit about what's going on here in the first couple of pages, we'll sort of talk about this introductory section for a little bit so that our listeners will have an opportunity to grasp onto something as they begin reading the novel on their own.
Yeah, that sounds good. The book itself, of course, is divided into 5 parts, and then across all the parts, there are these sort of non-marked, non-named, non-numerated sections. And the first section does appear to be something of a prologue or a preface, so it's always good to begin with the beginning, and I think it's worth just reading, and then we'll discuss briefly this opening paragraph of what we're calling the prologue. Camus writes, "The unusual events described in this chronicle occurred in 1904 - he leaves the year undefined. In this year at Oran. Everyone agreed that considering their somewhat extraordinary character, they were out of place there. For its ordinariness is what strikes one first about the town of Oran, which is merely a large French port on the Algerian coast, headquarters of the prefect of a French department." So for me, it seemed what was most striking, I mean, aside from what Camus himself says is most striking, the ordinariness, is the preceding remark, that everyone agreed that considering their somewhat extraordinary character, that is, the extraordinary character of these events, or the events chronicled, these people were out of place. Literally, pas à leur place. There was something out of order here. The disorder of the people is what seems to be hinted at initially by Camus. So they too are sort of surprised at the crisis that seemed to them to be so extraordinary, when in fact part of what Camus is suggesting is that crises like this are only extraordinary when we forget just how ordinary they can be in light of the grander human condition.
Yeah, no, that's right. When I read that, I don't read French as you do. And when you had mentioned that to me, it gave me a kind of new dimension, because I sort of took that as ordinariness of the people and extraordinariness of the times. And you took that as order and disorder. And I think we might be able to understand that in both senses of the word, right? We tend to think of political order as being orderly, right? That there's a kind of normal state of affairs, right? Here in 2016 to 2020 America, we've thought of these as extraordinary times. And we thought that perhaps nothing could be more extraordinary than where we find ourselves. And yet here we are in an even more extraordinary circumstance. And there might be a tendency, there probably is, for a lot of people to think of this as being on the verge of disorder. I see comments on Facebook and Twitter. My wife will send me screenshots of things that she sees as well. And, there are people that think, this is, equivalent to, the sacking of Rome, like that this is it. We're going to be in the dark ages next week. And the last thing that we need to be doing is starting a new podcast or going out for groceries, or, right, we need to hunker down with what we have, lock the door, be safe. And perhaps they're right. I tend to think not. But even if we are there, and even if we do descend into an age of disorder, there will come a time again in which we're back to political order in the orderly sense of that word. And so we can understand that political life, social life, however we want to think of it, is constantly fluctuating between these kinds of things: order and disorder, ordinary, extraordinary. And, that I think that's kind of what Camus is trying to tell us by the way that he's framing that. I think that might even be one of the reasons why he doesn't give us the year. It's 1940, and you get that dash on that last year. It's sort of like we can think of our time and our place often by decades, right? We think of them as like the 90s, right? Even though 1999 was probably closer culturally to 2001, before 9/11 anyway, than it was, say, 1990 or 91. And yet we tend to think of 1990 as being on the same plane in our minds as 1999. I think that's what Camus is telling us. It's almost by you strip away the specificity and you get to a kind of ordinariness. I mean, one of the things that I struck on later in the text, I forget exactly what page it was, maybe page 3 or 4, he says that I think the exact quote is, "Nothing is more commonly nowadays than to see people working from morn till night and then proceeding to fritter away at the card tables and the cafes and a few other things such as that." And I read that and I saw him as, again, describing the same kind of phenomenon, the kind of the modern commercial political life regime, the modern commercial republic. There's no mention of high culture. There's no mention of theater. There's no mention of the symphony or opera. It's work and frittering away, right? There's toil and there's distraction. There's a kind of flattening out of what it means to be human in that kind of world, because we're just moving from our day job to sitting in front of the television. Our day job, television, day job, television. Saturday comes and we go out and we do something and there's no real substance to it. And then by Sunday, we're doing laundry and buying groceries again and getting ready for the week. And all of that ordinariness, that banality has been obliterated these last few weeks. And I think in the novel that we're about to see that the same thing is going to happen to Iran.
Yeah, that's right. And you use the word banality, which is something that Camus himself uses to describe the town, both in its appearance and in the life, regarding the life that's lived in it. And it is striking the way that he says, well, we must begin thinking of Oran, this town he has in mind. He says the easiest way of making a town's acquaintance is to ascertain how the people in it work, how they love, and how they die. And Camus spends a sort of a paragraph addressing each of these aspects of life in Oran. Regarding work, you've already hinted at that. I mean, love is something that's certainly not experienced in its amplitude by the people in Oran, and likewise, even death is something that's treated with a kind of lack of seriousness almost. I mean, there is something banal about the work, the love, and death of all those in the town of Oran. And he follows this, or at one point punctuates these remarks or observations by saying that really all of our contemporaries are much the same. So this is at once, I think, an account of the universal possibilities of human beings who fall into a state of, let's say, complacency or banality on the one hand, but it is clearly a shot across the bow regarding his contemporaries in France and maybe in the Western world more broadly. And no doubt it takes something of an extraordinary event to awaken people from their sense of complacency, their orientation towards a life of mere comfort. Some of the positive things, as you suggest, that the commercial republic that Oran seems to be an example of, some of the positive things in our lives that may nonetheless lead us to a situation where our life becomes banal. So no doubt a crisis awakens the characters in Oran and will indeed awaken us. Was there anything else that struck you about the prologue here, or should we say something about the narrator, perhaps, or what would you like to?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts here about the narrator that I'll ask you. But one other thing, at least just dovetailing off of your last comment here, there's a line again for me. It's on page 5 in my edition when he's describing Oran. He says, "Treeless, glamourless, soulless. The town of Oran ends by seeming restful, and after a while, you go complacently to sleep there." And again, what I took from that is you get to Iran, you look at the city, and he describes it earlier as a kind of ugly place. There's nothing magnificent yet about it. It's everywhere, and yet it's nowhere. And then where does it end, right? So you enter the town, and you never really leave the town because it's so boring and bland and uniform, and you yourself fall into a kind of complacency. And I think that gets us back to that ordinariness that he was describing in the very beginning, that those are the kinds of people that he's going to be looking at very soon who are shocked out of their complacency, and the complacency that we ourselves might even be in right now, that we need to recognize that we're in that complacency, even if we think that we're not. Most of us think that we are self-conscious, we are deliberate, we are, all of these other things, and yet, Camus seems to be suggesting that we're not.
Yeah, that's right. And following the remark of banality, and just slightly before that passage, that nice passage you pointed out, Camus says really that, in Iran, you can get through the days there without trouble, right? Once you have formed habits. So there is a kind of a sense that there's not a lot of struggle in a place like Iran. You have your patterns of behavior, your habits of heart and mind, we might say, in a Tocquevillian fashion. And as long as you're sort of riding the waves of your habits, you will be fine. But who's to say, or what's to say, that these habits are in fact, the right ones, or the responsible ones, or maybe even the virtuous ones, or never mind the noble ones. And we are forced to question our habits, and our lives become troubled in the process. But maybe it's out of this sense of trouble and out of this reflection upon our habits that we open possibilities for ourselves and for our town, or for the political community more broadly, beyond this banal existence.
We're getting a little long on time, and so I let me begin to wrap up where we are by just asking you about the narrator. I don't want you to tell us who it is, because you've read the book, I have not. He or she explicitly says that the identity will be made known in due course, and so we're not given the identity, but it's at least hinted at that the narrator is not some random person, but somebody who at least was maybe participating in these events or somehow related to these events. What is your understanding of this? You might call it a literary device, that we're sort of introduced to the narrator as an actual character, and not just somebody who is abstract that you never really get to see as might be the case in other novels.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I certainly don't have a definitive answer, but I think his use of the narrator to sort of play with the ideas of the different ideas of how history is accounted for, how these, as he calls them, chronicles are formulated, and indeed what the data, the documents and the data, as he even says, that a historian or a narrator might turn to provide an account for a series of events, as we find in Iran. And it is his way of, I think, it is his way of suggesting that events themselves are important, but the moral significance of human action and the responses to events are indeed the deeper significance than the particular details of an event in the more rudimentary sense. So he wants to play with these ideas of a kind of scientific historian on the one hand who seeks objectivity in accounting for the events, and more of a moral historian of the kind that really I think Camus imagined himself to be.
Yeah, no, that's good. That makes a lot of sense, at least on this first reading of these passages. We should probably wrap this up by discussing our plan for this podcast and the number of episodes that we think we have going on. Anybody listening to this episode is encouraged to go out, really any edition or translation that you can find. I am reading a really early edition that's translated by Stuart Gilbert. I think you have the same translator, but a different edition, and so our pages don't line up. Although I also have the Kindle edition, so I can read either on my physical book or but I think we're going to use your edition and year, which is the more recent one in terms of page count. If people sort of go up and look at it, maybe you can tell them what year it came out and whatnot. And the working plan, I think, is to read one part per episode that we do. You mentioned that there are 5 parts to this novel. One or two of them are quite long, and so we might break it up. We might end up having 6 or maybe 7 episodes to do 5 parts, and then maybe at the very end, we'll tack on another episode to talk about the text more broadly. Listeners are more than encouraged to engage with us on Twitter or via email or any other way that they would like to. Our hope is that this will be a community project. I've seen examples of this done in the past. People have used hashtags. I think maybe we'll just use hashtag Camus, which is CAMUS, so that we can find it on Twitter or other types of social media and hopefully integrate listener feedback or listener comments or questions into future episodes about the text.
Yeah, that sounds great. Hope you'll join us.
Welcome to Pandemic Dialogues from the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. This series seeks to sustain the intellectual community we built with students, ASU colleagues, and the wider community while our regular speaker events are postponed. We offer the dialogues in two modes: a series of live webinars, each discussing a great work on pandemics and civic crisis, and this podcast, with extended discussion of Camus' novel, The Plague. More on the dialogues and the school is at scetl.asu.edu.
Once again, thank you for joining us for this very first episode, number 0 of Pandemic Dialogues, brought to you by the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. This has been myself, Luke Perez, and Trevor Shelley. Music today is from the opera A Feast in a Time of Plague by Russian composer Alexander Kuy.